we've known one another for really quite a long time, for about 15 years. And we first worked together back in 2006 when you curated an exhibition called The Artistic Construction of Memory for the 4th International Conference on Memory, which we organised together here in Sydney. So we had over 1,000 memory scholars from around the world who had the opportunity to visit your exhibition, as well as see your artwork featured on the covers of our program books. And here's one of those beautiful images from that conference. Emma, what do you think is the value of these sorts of multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary opportunities? How does your work reflect your engagement with varying concepts of memory from different disciplinary traditions?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity, and also thank you for the opportunity all those years ago. I also have been looking at my little mementos of the things that we produced. What was fascinating about that collaboration was, although it was an international conference on memory for, if you like, science-based and orientated scholars, you gave me the opportunity to bring in the voice of artists and designers who also work in memory. And what we did was we deliberately designed the exhibition using the device of, for example, scientific illustration posters. So right. I looked out my old poster and I popped it up on the wall and behind me there. But more than that, I think sometimes we're not always aware how much artists draw on the work of science and other disciplines in being inspired in their work. And there are two key texts in terms of scholarship that I've drawn on. One is Colin Renfrew's Figuring It Out, which is looking at the parallel visions of archaeologists and artists who really, they work in very similar ways. And another text is Exploring the Invisible. And this one is by Lynn Gamble, and it looks at art and science, and in particular, the influence that, for example, the invention of telescopes and then the invention of microscopes had on the work of artists and designers throughout history. So I feel that this parallel vision overlaps, but perhaps doesn't overlap as much as it used to in the past. If you look at the drawings of Galileo or the drawings of Leonardo, those individuals would have seen themselves not as artists or scientists, but both. There's this sort of conceptual blend, if you like.
Yeah, so interesting. And a lot of your work, the images that you shared is sort of really telescoping in, isn't it, of microscopic images of the one that we've used for the journal sort of also reminds you of brains and neural connections, but it's also of sort of environmental things, of botanic things, isn't it? So is that what you're using really meaningfully?
Yes. I mean, I was thinking about this because I do an exercise with some of my drawing for design students where in the very first 5 minutes of a class, I want to get them drawing, and I just get them to use the outline of their hand. And if you think back to early cave art, what you're seeing on the walls of a cave is the memory of a hand, but it's not the thing itself. It's an artistic rendering. It's somebody saying, here is my mark, and here I was here. So if you even take something as simple as a handprint, a child today, there's a learning development stage where they become fascinated by their own handprints. And we often will save the handprints of a child at different ages and stages, because that is a very visual marker of growth and development. But also it's a little snapshot of a period in time. And if I was to write a sentence, my child's hand at the age of 2, it's not nearly as resonant as actually having a little painted handprint of that child's image.
Oh, you're so right. Actually, hanging on the walls of my house, I have a print that was made. I think it's sort of a Rudolph, a Christmas motif, but it's my daughter made it with her little feet and her little hands, and it's hanging on our wall, and and it's so evocative of that time of how old she was at that time. So.
Yeah. And initially, I mean, I don't think I could get my answer to you fast enough when your email popped in about the Memory, Mind and Media journal, because this transdisciplinary idea, I think, is very, very timely and very, very fitting. And I promised to show you the actual drawing that I used for our journal cover design.
So your work is featured on the journal, the cover of the journal, exactly.
And it really is it acts as a metaphor for what we're trying to do, because the drawing itself is based on the idea of those kits that you get, that you build something from.
Yes.
You get instructions, but there's always a little bit of interpretation and sort of personal things. So instead of it being a kit to make an airplane or a car, this particular kit is a little series of images about the work of scientists, the work of artists. There's got some leaves, so that you've got some little botanical details there. And it also, importantly, from my perspective, also has words.
Exactly. The mind.
So I'm fascinated by this overlap between verbal ways of describing memory and articulating aspects of that, and also the visual, and how we can bring those two things more clearly into conjunction with one another.
Exactly. And it's also very evocative to me of sort of hieroglyphs, of sort of the sorts of imagery that you would see in sort of on Egyptian monuments and things. So what's the reaction that you have? You reminded me, and I had forgotten this, that the sort of the art exhibition for our conference in memory, that it was on poster boards. And of course, when you go to a typical scientific conference, you know, people put up their sort of, you know, information about their work on posters. And I'd forgotten that, actually. What are some of the reactions that you get from people, sort of scientists or historians or others? You know, how do they react to the sort of depictions of this intersection between your work, your discipline, and their discipline?
Well, the interesting thing about an exhibition is it's very much a moment in time. And so I wanted it to live on beyond that moment in time, because there's quite a lot of work in collating it. So the first thing I did is I chose 9 artists around the world. We had an artist from Canada, from the UK, from various different countries. And what I was looking for was that they all worked relating to memory, but in quite different ways. So we had someone who parents had been in the Holocaust, and this idea of trauma being carried forward and memories generationally. And her work was in glass, and, you know, so her work was very distinctive. And we had an artist in Canada who edits pieces of text so that only one word out of a whole page will appear, and it's like this little anchoring word. And what I wanted it to do, which is why we then produced the summary CD and the posters themselves, is I wanted it to be a form of collaboration, me to you and the team at ICOM, but also to be a communication from me to someone in Canada. And I was so touched. I think one of my favorite memories of the whole thing was actually when it was all over, because I rolled up these enormous posters, popped them into tubes, and posted them to the artists. So they had sent their work to me, and this comes to this idea of media. They sent their work to me digitally. I didn't want the responsibility of original artworks and having to have, you know, people making sure that they didn't get stolen. And so I decided to design and make these enormous posters. And then I sent the posters to the artists, and I got this wonderful series of emails as they were surprised when they received the thing. So it became this form of communication. It wasn't just the collaboration. And it stuck in everyone's minds. I had people coming up to me at the exhibition opening and talking to me about the parallels that they felt it made them remember in their own lives. And so a particular conversation about someone, for example, who also had family history connected to the Holocaust and to trauma. So I feel that there were a lot of very interesting conversations. And the other interesting thing about the ICOM was I attended presentations. I went to as many as I possibly could. And when I was coming home in the evenings to our own family, I was relating the stories. And we still talk about one of the presentations where the woman had talked about a long-term study of adolescents who they wanted to show that if you had family dinners together, uninterrupted, that it would lead to less alcoholism or drug use or deviant, you know, patterns of behavior. And so as a running joke in our family, it became, you know, phones off the table. We need to talk to one another so we don't, you know, end up somewhere we don't want to really go. And we still talk about that presentation. It was a really
That's so
powerful...
funny. I'm getting goosebumps because I saw the exact talk, and you're talking about Robin Fibush's work. And Robin, we've also done a video with Robin, and she's one of the authors of one of our inaugural pieces. So Robin was talking about a study in which they had done a longitudinal study focusing on kids who were like 2 years old, and then sort of developed over time. And what they were looking at is the power of family conversations around the dinner table and of reminiscence. And they basically reported that adolescents and into young adulthood who knew the stories of their parents and knew the stories of their grandparents had much better psychological outcomes and resilience by the time they got to that period. And I did exactly the same thing, because I listened to that talk and I was like, oh, and my son was about 2 years old at the time. And we started a whole bunch of reminiscence practices as well. I mean, you know, for him, it was sort of in the bathtub. It was sort of like, tell me about your day. And we told stories. And my kids, who are now, they're now 17 and 13, are really good narrators. You know, they'll come and, oh, what happened to you today? And tell me about your day. And they'll ask about my day, and they'll ask about their dad's day, because we heard exactly the same thing. And how funny that 15 years later, it still sort of resonated in our lives.
That's
the way we parent.
There is actually a model of thinking for this.
Yeah.
And it's something also I use with our students. And it used to be called bi-association in the 1960s, but the more recent term is conceptual blending.
Okay.
And so if you imagine that, you know, Amanda and Emma met for the first time during ICOM 4, and then you look at this overlap that we generated through our collaboration and through our conversations and the things that it sparked, there's an even richer thing that happened there, which is you exposed me through your network to other people, such as Robin's amazing, powerful talk, such that 15 years later, I'm still living and thinking about what I was exposed to. And I would not have gone to ICOM 4 if it hadn't been for the fact that you'd invited me to be part, you know, to do some of the design outcomes for it. So no, I love conceptual blending. A lot of new ideas in interdisciplinary practice come from a very simple overlap of two individuals.
Yeah,
and that's so I'm very interested.
Of the journal, isn't it? That's what we're looking for, that kind of conceptual blending. There's at least a couple of other topics in which you and I really have interest in common. And I want to ask you next about sort of autobiography. So some of your work is focused on drawing as autobiography, and how images in your sketchbooks and others can act as diaries. Can you tell us more about this and the idea of that as memory aids? I presume that this kind of methodology has a really long history. You know, you talked about, you know, long ago scientists are sort of drawing things. So tell us a bit about your work in that space.
So for me, my visual diary acts very much like somebody else's written diary might. And I've been having this conversation with people about, you know, do you keep a journal? And sometimes, you know, people have journals that are both visual and verbal, but sometimes people are only write. And so for me, my journals are very much visual.
Oh, so you don't really, there's not much writing in them.
No. So this is the one that I travel with. And I often get more time when I'm traveling to actually do drawings. But I will often draw one thing multiple different ways. So I will draw the thing itself and then maybe an echo or a shadow of it. And this is a larger, you know, something as simple as an apple. You might say that's a standard study of an apple. But then if I'm drawing the apple, I'm also interested in the void of the shape. What when you have the absence of the apple, what does that look like? And this idea of, you know, different shapes being refracted. And perhaps an easier way to explain how that might become a piece of artwork is, for example, when I was 10, we lived for several years in Baghdad, and I was taken one day to the Iraq Museum. And I was given some copies of Mesopotamian cylinder seals from 5,000-6,000 years ago. And as a child, I used to play with this and you know, roll it out onto plasticine. And I was fascinated by this mark. It's the early precursor of writing, these images that were carved into the seals. And I keep them in my studio in a little box that my brother Gavin made for me. And I've actually used that idea and developed it into a series of drawings, but obviously I am not from Mesopotamia. So my repeating images, for example, in this one is a swallow, and this particular swallow is a symbol of loss and memory. So that's where an object becomes a metaphor and symbol for something else. But you, Amanda, would have different memories from when you were 10 and different objects around you that have meaning and value to you.
Right. Yes, exactly. So there's such a tradition in sort of memory research of diary studies, in understanding sort of the patternings and the trajectory of autobiographical memory. But as you say, they tend to be, you know, canonically sort of written diaries. But yeah, the fact that images, whether photos or self-created things or ticket stubs from trips away or whatever it might be, artifacts are serving as your memory aids here.
Yeah, Colin Renfrew mentions in that book, The Parallel Visions of Artists and Archaeologists, the work of Merlin Donald. And Merlin Donald wrote a lot about symbolic storage. And sometimes there is symbolic storage within a particular object that's personal to you, but we also have cultural symbolic storage, so that a particular place or thing can have meaning for many people. So I find all of those sort of interrelationships very interesting in memory studies.
Yeah, so you've been exploring quite recently the idea of sort of artifacts and sort of how the external world can scaffold internal memory. And I'm you know, absolutely fascinated by this as well. Philosophers call this idea distributed cognition, and it's the idea that, you know, it's not, memory doesn't start and stop at the head, at the skull. It's actually extending by default out into the world. So can you share a bit more about your work in this space, any current work or work that you've been doing and what you've been thinking about here about the sort of power of artifacts and to support good habits of memory?
Yeah, I loved, and I have recently been rewatching some of your videos, and they're just such a fantastic series. I really encourage everyone to check out all of the others. And in episode 4, you used the word transition. And I've always been fascinated by that word, you know, the moving of one thing into another thing and a different way of understanding it. And so I think that objects and subjects can be mediated. For example, I was influenced, in fact, it was part of my own PhD study, but I saw an image by Christo on the cover of Time magazine. And it was the first time that an artist had been commissioned by Time to do a cover. So it was, you know, obviously Time magazine, it's a form of media and writing. And he did this thing called wrapped globe. And it was an image of the world as you would get on a normal globe, but wrapped in dirty plastic, lying cast on the edge of a beach, which looked like it had some smears of oil on it. And I found it a very powerful image, but I also found it quite depressing. Yeah. And so I decided to respond to that object and that media image. It was just, the artwork was done specifically for the cover of Time. And I came up with this series of objects. There's another one just behind me here, where I took happier memories about the world. And the particular subject was living fossils, plants that have been on Earth for more than 150 million years and have survived as humans. Yeah. And so I started to do a big series of three-dimensional works where this was enacted. And it was my response to Christo's work on the cover of a magazine. Yeah. So we get our inspiration, both scientists and artists, both from lots of different sources and different places. Yeah. And it was a really conscious, and I actually ended up doing 3 families of globes, 14 in total. And they group together and they interrelate with one another. So it really became quite a strong series of works. I often work in multiples and in series.
And it's such an interesting conversation as well. And I think that's something you're going to talk a little bit later about what you sort of the vision for the role of art and imagery and media in the journal. But that kind of conversation of sort of he's done a work and, you know, you're in conversation with that to think about it anew and to reflect on it, which seems like something we'd love to have as part of the journal. We're excited to see how it all develops. What sorts of contributions would you like to see? Would you invite our colleagues to send? Not just sort of what kind of content in terms of concepts or questions, but also what forms of submission would you be excited? Are you really encouraging people to send to us?
Well, I got a very big smile on my face because, as you can imagine, I can still remember your reaction when we were working on ICOM 4. And at our second meeting, I said, I got this idea and that idea and the other idea. And you were saying, we only need one idea.
Oh, did I?
As you can probably imagine, I have lists, Amanda. I've got lots of lists of possibilities at the moment. But one of the things that's really struck me, and it's from watching these fantastic interviews that you've done, so all credit to you and to Andrew, is that as I'm hearing people talk about their research, these different scholars from different fields of memory studies, I get images in my mind. I'm getting, inspired by what I'm hearing them say, so the 7 sins of memory, I see that as a picture. So I'm really keen to try to get artists and designers involved in a special issue, if you like, but to perhaps do it in a way that I myself had the opportunity some years ago. And the Scottish Arts Council came up with this concept called WordWorks. And what they did was they selected 10 Scottish artists and they chose 10 Scottish poets. And each artist was simply sent a poem and they were asked to respond to it. So I would absolutely love to use this incredible website that you've now built, all of the resources, to almost as a form of provocation to artists and designers, and to get their visual responses to some of these things. And the reason that I'm keen to try to do this sort of almost like a word-inspired series of images is I sometimes suspect when we talk about transdisciplinary, we're actually just looking at people on parallel tracks who aren't really genuinely crossing over with one another or being exposed to each other's networks in the way that you and I were 15 years ago. So I would love to actually use the content on the website and to say, look, here are some terms, here are some ways of thinking about memory, here are some structures about how they think that the brain works. And I'm fascinated by the new research that is coming out. So if we were inspired by telescopes, we're inspired by microscopes, now we can be inspired by neuroscience and these studies of how our brains work. And I feel that scientists and artists can really collaborate in a very genuine and meaningful way to produce images that would not exist one without the other.
Exactly.
So it comes back to what I started at the beginning, talking about this idea of a conceptual blend. And I would absolutely love to facilitate a process where this can really be explored.
Exactly. And that, again, it's right at the heart of what we're aiming to do here, which is to be more than the sum of our parts. Andrew and I talk a lot about, and I'm really interested personally in my research on the idea of emergence, how 1 + 1 = 5. So, what does it mean to not just be working on similar things to tell one another about them, but to actually transform our own ideas because we've listened to one another. And what we want the journal to be able to do is have contributions where when I pick up anybody else's work, whether it's imagery or written, I have that reaction that you've just described, which is, oh my goodness, this is very inspiring. So we're really insisting on sort of as little jargon as possible in these contributions that we've implemented into our review process, a sort of a cross-disciplinary reviewer, so that in addition to our contributors' work being read by disciplinary experts, it's also going to be read by someone outside their discipline who says, I get it, I love it, I want to drop everything and do that, which I think is the mark of excellent work. So let's talk a little bit about kind of, what we can accommodate or what you think we want people to send, because we can include videos, we're recording videos, we can include imagery. I mean, we want all of those kinds of things, yes?
Andrew, you and I worked on a document that was really specific to, well, if artists and designers are going to be involved and what sorts of materials we would accept. And we went through, there's lots of different aspects to including more imagery And I would just love to see that almost like a 50-50 balance of text being integrated with a diagram, and something that's been designed specific so that it explains maybe a complicated theory about memory in a visual way that helps people remember that information. So I think that it can be both design technical, but also artistic and interpretive.
Yeah.
And I see that those two things are not necessarily unrelated.
Yeah.
And I'd love to, I have already some people I know who are artists and designers, some who use word imagery and actual words within their work, which I think is also a nice way of illustrating things. And it reminds me of this idea of our current media time, where if you think about a meme, and a meme is an image, often with something catchy or funny attached to it. But it's always those two things together. It's not just words on its own. A meme, you know, we share memes, funny memes with one another.
Yeah.
And I'm really interested in this idea. It actually comes, I think, from what used to be called the 6-word story, how you can do more with less.
Right.
So you reduce down your words, but then you make the thing much more visually powerful. There's some fascinating research. There's a book called Dear Data about a correspondence between two women in Italy and the US. And they exchanged postcards for a year, but the postcards were drawings. And the postcards were data that they gathered on things that they remembered from each day.
Fantastic.
And it sort of gave this kind of zoomed out, but zoomed in kind of imagery.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's the fact that they collaborated with one another and sent the things back and forth. Those sorts of projects really fascinate me. And I think that we can use that kind of thing to springboard off for the journal. Exactly.
It reminds me of, I've seen on Twitter or, you know, sort of on social media imageries of sort of knitting that people have done where every line of a long scarf is sort of the temperature of the day or whether it was raining and then over time you end up getting this long, you know, sort of account. Of course, that's just an individual sort of supporting the sort of remembering of the, you know, the trajectory of a year, but when it's also collective and collaborative, over the last 10 years or so, I think, you know, I've talked to you before about the work that we've been doing with long married elderly couples, and they're sort of remembering together patterns. And you know, like you, the book that you showed us, they have all these books about their travel that they've printed out, and they have, you know, lots of footage and recordings. And, you know, one gentleman told us about how he'd sit his kids down at the beginning of every school year and interview them and sort of, so what are you looking forward to today? And what do you think about your teachers? And how they had gathered so much archival material about their own lives and what it meant to them in the sense of, you know, and how they built their worlds around them. You go into their homes and their homes are completely surrounded by artifacts that support that sense of who we are together and where have we been, and, you know, and what does the future hold for us. We've got to share that, I guess, that in the journal, share all those sort of things, because words on a page won't really capture it, will it?
Yeah, I've loved the work so far. I've loved reading the articles that you've got listed. As I say, it inspires me. It gives me, you know, lots of visual ideas as well. And it would be really, really nice. I'm so looking forward to integrating the work of artists and designers. And I have had a previous experience of being an artist in residence for a year at the Royal Botanic Gardens. And it was just, the thing that was really struck me about that time wasn't as much the work that I produced or the exhibition that I had at the Red Box Gallery in the gardens, but the people that I met and the stories they shared and how they influenced and changed the way that I thought about endangered plant species. So I feel that the journal has this genuine collaborative potential to truly conceptually blend people together, get them to have some different conversations, to spark off one another, and to make new work as a result. So I'm really looking forward to this opportunity.
So you've got an idea already that you're planning a special issue or a collection. Any sort of first thoughts about where you're hoping to go with that?
So I'd love this idea of getting artists and designers to respond to the content that is even already there. Yeah. So it's one thing for an artist to respond in their own practice to do with memory, but I think that they can also read the work, the current research of memory scholars. And I think that there's another layer that we can put on top of that so that it speaks to this overlap between memory, mind, and media.
Yes, exactly. Because it's really, we absolutely want them at the intersection. So any advice for potential contributors? Can they reach out to you to propose things? Any advice to them before we finish up?
Absolutely. So you can pop my email address in e.robertson@unsw.edu.au. I would love to hear from artists and designers whose work is involved with memory, and particularly if they'd like to share some images with me as I start to work on this special issue.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Emma. It's been such a delight to talk to you. If everyone would like to read more about, and more importantly, see Emma's beautiful images and art, you can follow us on Twitter at MMM where our profile features Emma's images, or visit us on Cambridge University Press Memory, Mind and Media. I really hope you've enjoyed our conversation today. We'll see you again soon.